Hello, everyone, and welcome to the American Family Insurance Dream Bank, where we believe in the transformative power of dreams. I'm Hannah, Dream Curator here at Dream Bank, and on behalf of our team, we are thrilled to have you with us. For those of you who have attended our virtual or in-person events in the past, welcome back. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to Dream Bank. Here at American Family Insurance, we believe communities are stronger and the future is brighter when people are actively pursuing their dreams. That's why we created DreamBank, an inspirational community destination and digital experience dedicated to dreamers everywhere. From our daily events series to immersive signature programs, there's something for every dreamer, and our offerings are designed to help you celebrate the dream journey, overcome obstacles, and stay motivated. Before we get started today, I wanted to share DreamBank's excitement around our upcoming offerings in celebration of Native American Heritage Month and National Veterans and Military Families Month. We have an excellent lineup of events planned and invite you to check them out at our website, amfam.com/dreambank, and our social channels. And I'll put that link in the chat to make it easy for all of you. Now I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful speaker this afternoon, Paige Knipfer. Paige is the owner of Love Grown Adoption Consulting, and at her day job is the associate manager at CUNA for the past 9 years. Yeah. She lives in Brooklyn, just outside of Oregon, Wisconsin, with her husband Sean, first grader Aria, and 3-year-old Colt. In her free time, she enjoys photography, mentoring youth, and traveling, and she is a lover of Gilmore Girls, Halloween, coffee, and books. Her business, Love Grown Adoption Consulting, has surpassed any of her dreams she's had, but envisions doing more education work in the future and someday writing a tell-all book. If you have any questions throughout the event, leave them in the comments and we'll get to your questions at the end. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our fantastic speaker this afternoon, Paige Knipfer.
Hi, all. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you, Hannah, for having me, and thank you, DreamBank. I'm Paige Knipfer. I will be talking about adoption today because November is National Adoption Awareness Month, if you did not know that. And as I said, I'm Paige. I'm an adoptive mom of 2 kiddos. I am a home study educator for the state of Wisconsin. I own Love Grown Adoption Consulting, which helps families who are pursuing their adoption journey. So I want you to think about what you think about when you hear the word adoption. Just again, kind of just movies maybe probably pop into your head, or books maybe you've read, and just kind of think about what you think about when you hear the word adoption. Around 7 million Americans are adopted, and around 140,000 children are adopted by American families each year. 6 in 10 Americans have personal experience with adoption. So that means they themselves or a family member or a close friend has adopted a child or have placed a child for adoption. On the lower left of your screen, too, I included an image. This is kind of the common image that's used for adoption. It's a heart with a triangle, and the triangle represents the 3 kind of triad pieces of adoption. So the birth parents, the adoptive parents, and the adoptee. So I'm sure you thought about movies when you heard the word adoption, or TV shows too, but I used movies as my example. There's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to adoption, and I wanted to kind of talk about those first. So if you've thought about the movie Despicable Me, which I know is a great movie, and I love Minions just as much as anyone else, but there is some misconceptions. So Gru, if you haven't watched this movie, is the man pictured there, and he walks into, I believe, an orphanage and adopts 3 girls and comes home that day in the movie, and that's not what happens, right? The adoption process is a little more complicated than that and takes more time than that. The other movie I wanted to talk about is Annie. Annie is a really well-known movie, and I think it was remade recently in the past couple of years. But orphanages don't exist in the United States. Right around the 1960s, which we'll talk about the history of adoption, foster care was set up through the federal government, and orphanages ceased to exist. So that kind of premise of the movie really, like I said, just isn't a thing anymore. And then the other movie, which I also love, right, Juno, kind of gives a misconception that a lot of adoptions are teen pregnancies. And in the United States, teen pregnancy continues to decline. And actually, the average woman who makes an adoption plan is in her late 20s. She's not a teenager. So I always like to combat that misconception of adoption. And then adoption costs. So it really depends on the route you take towards adoption, which will, again, I'll kind of talk about all the routes you can do to pursue adoption in the United States. But domestic infant adoption is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States, so there is quite a significant cost when pursuing adoption that way. So as I said, I really want to talk about the adoption history. So history, I believe, kind of explains why we are where we are in the adoption world, and it's so important, right? In anything you're learning to kind of look at the history. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a train, and this is called the orphan train movement. So it's a welfare program that transported children from typically crowded eastern cities to rural areas in the Midwest. The orphan trains operated from 1854 to 1929. So this timeline I'm showing you is kind of the 1850s to the 1950s, and then we'll move on in the timeline. But around that time, this relocated over 250,000 children. So the co-founders of the orphan train movement claim these children were orphaned, abandoned, or homeless, but many of that was not true. Most of these children were new immigrants or children of poor or destitute families living in those cities. And then around, like I mentioned, foster care system or orphanages, right, ceased to exist in the United States, and foster care systems were set up in the United States. We do have group homes, but again, we don't have any orphanages in the United States. And then I used another example. So this was common practice in like the 1920s to 1950s, but I used Georgia Tan as my example, but she is an example of many that existed during this time period. Georgia Tan was an American child trafficker who operated the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Tan used an unlicensed home as a front for her black market baby adoption scheme, again, from the 1920s to the 1950s. Now, at the time, it wasn't seen as a scheme. She actually wasn't prosecuted, or no charges came to light until after she passed away. People just weren't aware that she was doing this. So she would often essentially kidnap kids from certain places. And so the picture in the upper right of your screen is the Mississippi River. So a lot of people lived on boats on the Mississippi River. She would kidnap children from that area, or at least that's one of the routes that she pursued. And then she would place them in typically wealthier homes. These prospective adoptive parents or these wealthy parents didn't know. They were often lied to and told that, of course, that this child was orphaned, and often not told the history, right, of the birth family. There was no connection to the biology for the adoptee. And also, too, common practice was to not tell the adoptee they were adopted. There were, again, no connection whatsoever. So the next part of history is the 1950s to 1980s. So again, these are some examples. So the baby scoop era, which I'll talk about even further on the next slide, was after World War II ended in the early 1970s. This increased the rate of premarital pregnancies, right? And at the time, too, birth control was becoming more available. So there's a lot of factors, right, that went into this baby scoop era, or a baby boom, right, after World War II. So from 1945 to 1973, there's an estimated 4 million parents in the United States that had children placed for adoption. To give that perspective, this is infant adoption. In the United States, there's under 10,000 adoptions that occur today in a year, and that are domestic infants. And what's mind-blowing is just the 1960s alone experienced 2 million adoptions. So again, there's just a lot of things and factors I'll talk about in a second that culminated to why we're seeing such a significant increase in birth rates and then adoption plans being made. And then part of kind of, again, the 1970s is Operation Baby Lift. Like I said, this is an example of what is occurring also at this time. So you'll see a picture there that is in the upper right of your screen. Those are all newborns on an airplane coming to the United States, Australia, France, West Germany, and Canada. They were evacuated from South Vietnam after the Vietnam War in April of 1945, and that was roughly 3,300 children and infants that were evacuated and then obviously adopted out in those countries. So that's international adoption, but I still wanted to kind of touch on that as well, just of other things that we were seeing in the United States. So then we're going to go back to that baby scoop era. And you'll see pictured here some homes. So these are housed by the government or funded by the government, but they're called maternity homes or homes for unwed mothers. You'll see there were hundreds, but that's an example of one in the upper left of your screen, and then down below, obviously, are all the babies. This was often managed or paid for by churches as well. It was unlikely that an unmarried woman would leave this experience with her baby. Adoption rates at these maternity homes were 96%. To give you an idea, today, it's 2%. And again, there's a lot of factors of why this occurred. A lot of unmarried mothers, right, were relinquishing their babies for adoption. Mothers were routinely denied legal rights to see, hold, feed babies at birth. Some were told that their babies died, only to learn that their child had been adopted later on when that child sought out reunion. Others still didn't know if they delivered a boy or a girl. Mothers reported uses of threat, fear, lies, trickery to obtain uninformed consents with no legal counsel, many signing alone with a caseworker in attendance. And mothers weren't really given, again, their rights to this. Again, too, we're talking about the stigma associated with being unmarried at the time and getting pregnant. And so these two books on the right side, if you were wanting to learn more about this time period in the United States, The Girls Who Went Away, get a tissue box, but it is a compilation of a lot of different women's stories during this, or experiences, I shouldn't say stories, it is their experience during this time period. And then also if they were unified with that child. So there's a lot of, like I said, great stories in that. And then Wake Up Little Susie is also another book about this time period. And then I want to talk about some like laws, policy changes, things that have occurred in the adoption world. So there's really only one federal law that exists with adoption, which is kind of crazy. So the Adoption and Safe Families Act is a federal law that was passed in 1997, which places time frames and requirements on states to move children from foster care into adoption when appropriately and in a timely manner. This still isn't always happening, right? But again, this law was put into place to not have children stay in foster care, right? The goal would be to have them be adopted and not stay in one placement for too long. And then, so these are not necessarily laws, some of them are, but International Child One Policy, I wanted to quick flip to international adoption. So China opened up their orphanages to the United States in 1992 at the wake of their one-child policy. So if you're not familiar, China had an overpopulation problem, and their government decided to combat that to have a one-child policy. It meant that families could only have one child or had to pay a significant fee, depending on where they lived, to have a second child. So the number of international adoptions climbed and peaked in 2004 to the United States of roughly almost 23,000 adopted children from China. Now, China has closed their doors. International adoption with China has really significantly dropped, and I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. But I do want to mention that peak of international adoption and why that existed, especially from China. And then the second law that I wanted to talk about is ICAA, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act. In 1978, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, which made it incredibly difficult for anyone without tribal association to adopt a Native American child. They defined children as imperatives to the survival of tribes. So that's particularly important, right, again, in just keeping Native American children in tribes. And then the last piece of policy or shift, I guess, in ideology in adoption that I wanted to kind of touch on is transracial adoption. So in 1972, the National Association of Black Social Workers took a stand against Black children being placed in white homes. So I want to quick mention, in adoption, disproportionately so in foster care and in domestic infant adoption, we see African American children. So if you look at the demographic of the United States, right, disproportionately so, we see, unfortunately, African American children in foster care and adoption plans being made for. In 1992, the NAACP made a policy statement that Black children should be placed with Black families, but prefers transracial adoption over foster care. So as I'm saying this, right, there's such a high disproportion of African-American children in foster care. This kind of shifted things. So around like the end of 1980 and then the early 1990s, we started kind of seeing this shift of white parents being more accepted, so to speak, in society, adopting transracially. And that changes things quite drastically. So to give you an idea, around 70% of adoptions now in the United States are transracial adoptions. So I think that that's kind of just a significant shift we see that I wanted to make sure we talked about. So why does adoption exist? So this is a question I often have as well. So there's obviously quite a few factors that go into why this exists that I want to quick talk about. So poverty, of course, age, coercion, which we kind of talked about, society and family pressure still exists today, right? It's just become less. Again, of being an unwed person, those types of things, economic inequalities, addiction. So there's a baby born every 25 minutes born dependent on an illegal or prescription drug in the United States. Racism and systematic failures. So we were just kind of talking about that shift in ideology, but there are a larger microcosm of racial inequalities in the United States that have led right to those disproportionate numbers and have led to African-American families being discriminated against in pursuing adoption. And then infertility and saviorism, right? So an estimated 12% of women in the United States face challenges getting pregnant, and more people wait longer to start their families in the United States. So we're going to continue probably, unfortunately, to see that number rise. So that means 1 in 8 or 7.4 million women have received help for infertility in their lifetime in the United States. And then saviorism, I do want to quick touch on that. There is some people who pursue adopting for the belief that they are saving this child religiously as well, or rescuing this child. And then speaking kind of again of religion's role, I did want to quick touch on this as well. Agencies, even ones that receive federal funding, can refuse working with couples based on religion, sexual orientation, age, etc. So only 15 states have anti-discrimination laws in adoption. And to give you an idea, so Wisconsin state has non-discrimination laws but lack in gender identity protections. The ones that are in red have full LGBTQ non-discrimination protections. The ones that are gray have no protections. So again, even if it's foster care, which means it's federally funded, or an adoption agency, they can refuse to work with people based on all of these reasons, right? LGBTQ status, religion, age, and all of that, unfortunately. So types of adoption, I've been kind of touching on all of them, but I'm going to lay it out now. There are 3 ways you can pursue adoption in the United States. Foster care, which provides a temporary living situation for a child whose birth family cannot take care of them. International adoption, where you adopt a child from another country and bring them back to the United States. Domestic adoption, which typically means you're adopting in the United States and most commonly a newborn. An expecting parent selects an adoptive family while pregnant and makes an adoption plan. And then there's kind of some types of adoption as well. So open and closed or semi-open. So open and semi-open are, some form of contact with either pictures, videos, FaceTime visits. Today, almost 60 to 70% of domestic adoptions are open. So again, open means access to those medical records, and we're seeing that is proven to be psychologically better for the adoptee and the birth family. Again, just having those medical reference like contacts and just the open relationship. And then closed, of course, means there's no contact between the birth parents and adoptive parents and adoptee. Closed, obviously, as we talked about in history of adoption, was more common, right? A lot of records were sealed, and unfortunately, a lot of adoptees lost their access to that important information in their life. And so we're continuing to see that hopefully be less and less as the years go on, because we're learning how detrimental that was to families and adoptees. So let's talk about foster care. So I do have the movie Instant Family. If you haven't seen it, I actually do recommend seeing it. It is by far, in my opinion, one of the most accurate depictions of adoption. I like that it shows kind of both sides of what goes into being a foster parent. The one thing that because I'm picky, right? I'm going to be picky about everything with adoption. They don't spend much time kind of sharing the birth parent story at all really in that movie. But again, the other pieces of it are very accurate. So again, foster care is providing a temporary home for a child in need, and the goal of foster care is to reunify that child with its biological family. So oftentimes a biological family member will be provided a caseworker and have a plan to kind of remedy some of the things that are allowing them to not be a parent at the time, and fix those things right to then become that parent for that child. And also, if you're interested in learning more, the website adoptuskids.org is a great website that you can check out as far as foster care goes. So foster care. There's over, I think now, 400,000 children in foster care in the United States. Of that 400,000, there's roughly 120,000 that are available for adoption, meaning their parental rights have already been terminated. On average, these children are age 7, and 45% of them are under the age of 5. On the lower left, and I apologize if it's tiny on your screen, but on the lower left, you can see that foster care numbers continue to rise. And so that's very different, drastic difference from domestic infant adoption and international adoption, right? Those numbers are going to continue probably to decline, but foster care, unfortunately, continues to go up. And then I always mention, unfortunately, 23,000 kids in foster care system will age out every year. So many of these kids have no permanent placement lined up when they turn 18 and unfortunately become homeless. And then on the lower right of your screen is a percentage of our demographic of children in foster care waiting to be adopted. So the blue is white, 45%, 23% purple is African American, the green is 22% Latino or Hispanic, and then the orange is 8% multiracial, and then that 2%, very little, is American Indian and Alaskan Native. And as I talked about with international adoption, it's continuing to go down. I wanted to show this graph quick. Certain countries have shut down completely as well. So I'll mention Guatemala. It's a great example, and an unfortunate example. Their government was very concerned with a lot of trafficking issues they were seeing, and so they shut down international adoption. So that's continuing. And then obviously with COVID-19, that has just caused more roadblocks and implications as far as adopting internationally. And then now we're going to talk about domestic infant adoption, which is my area of expertise. So a couple things I always want people to know about domestic infant adoption. So that is where you're adopting typically a newborn in the United States. The National Council of Adoption estimates a 17% drop in the total number of adoptions in the United States. So I always mention, right, it's declining. The other thing I mentioned is trauma. So in history, it was believed that if you adopted a child that was young enough or a newborn, you had a clean slate. And that's not the case, right? There's always trauma with removing a child from its biological family. I also always mention there's not a need. So with foster care, huge need. We need foster care parents. We need people to adopt from foster care. But as far as adopting a newborn in the United States, there's not a need. There is an estimated 36 waiting families for every one child that an adoption plan is being made for, and an estimated 2 million couples waiting to adopt an infant in the United States. You'll notice these are estimations. So unfortunately, there's no federal reporting entity, which I'll talk about in my policy slide in a couple of slides ahead. But these are all kind of estimations of where our numbers are at. And then cost. So the average cost of a domestic infant adoption is $43,000 in the United States, and it continues to rise. So prospective adoptive couples take the financial risk in paying attorney, social work, representation for the expecting parents. They also pay expecting parent expenses while she's pregnant. And then in hopes, essentially, right, that she would make an adoption plan. Of course, though, she has every right to decide to parent as well. But those costs, like I said, will continue to go up, and I'll talk about why that is in a little bit too. The other thing with trauma that I wanted to mention is adoptees are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than non-adoptees. October 30th last week was actually Adoptee Remembrance Day. Adoptees often don't know their medical histories, which may include depression and other illnesses. Adoptees often don't want to upset their adoptive parents and concerns about depression, and they don't want to seem ungrateful. And this slide I know is a lot. So we will post my link of my website that has all these slides if you want to take a closer look later on. But I did like this graph because it talks about the core issues and why there is trauma with adoption. So at the root of it, right, it's loss. They have lost their biological connection. And so all these other things, right, tied to that of intimacy, identity, rejection, abandonment, guilt, shame, loyalty, fitting in, entitlement, grief, control, claiming, right? So there's a lot of things that go into that trauma that they've experienced. And then, of course, right, I'm always going to have some things for advocating policy change. So in federal regulation, there really, like I said, isn't much. There's no federal regulation for domestic infant adoption. And because of this, we're continuing to see people kind of make loopholes and flying, expecting parents to other states, because every state has their own laws on expecting parent expense caps, on when she terminates her parental rights. And so we're seeing a lot of weird loopholes. And I mentioned this. So Paul Peterson is an attorney who unfortunately was charged this past year with trafficking. So he was flying women from the Marshall Islands into Arkansas and then trafficking these children. So the adoptive couples often didn't know that, right, that this was occurring. And so he, like I said, he was charged recently this year in multiple states for that. I mention that because I think we often, unfortunately, think that this happened years ago, and it's happening now, right? We're seeing trafficking issues with adoption still this year. And it's just a great example of the loopholes that have existed. The other thing I wanted to mention is social media regulations. So there are none. A lot of these laws were written, prior to social media really taking control of adoption. A lot of families will self-advertise and try and find their own expecting parents. And unfortunately, there's a lot of Facebook groups that are notorious for the use of facilitating adoptions, meaning finding prospective families and expecting parents and matching them. So there's no regulation in that, and that is kind of concerning. And then reporting agencies, I talked about this, right? There's no really federal reporting. We don't have exact numbers of adoptions that are occurring. We don't have exact data because there's just no federal reporting data or entry. And there's no federal cap on domestic infant adoption. So because there's no cap on expenses, that's why I believe we'll continue to see those go up. And unfortunately, there's, like I said, certain states that have no cap, and so we continue to see more adoptions out of those states. The other thing I have to kind of quick talk about is, in addition to, right, all those policy things I just talked about, and culminating kind of some of these problems that need to be combated. So one of them is, agencies double matching families or scamming families. So unfortunately in 2019, an agency in Michigan was charged with essentially embezzling money from millions from prospective adoptive couples. She would double match, meaning she had one expecting parent, but she would match multiple families. Well, it's one baby, right? And so she was charged federally in 2019. And then on the right side, if you watch Dr. Phil, you may have seen this episode. Her name is Gabby. She's very well known in the adoption community as an example of what is occurring at a larger scale. She will pretend to be pregnant. She steals photos from women online of pregnancy, and then she will emotionally scam prospective families who are trying to pursue adopting. So she doesn't financially scam. There obviously are financial scammers out there as well, but she really just emotionally scams people. And she still continues to do this today, even after being on Dr. Phil, unfortunately. So what can you do besides the policy things that I've just talked about and advocating for some federal regulation, or you can look at your local state's adoption laws. I'm sure that you can find some that need to be adjusted. But you can also educate yourself and educate others. So educating yourself, there's a lot of great books that I've already kind of mentioned, and I can definitely provide a bigger list if you're interested. But In on It, so it's called In on It. It's on Amazon. It's under $10. If you have a family or a friend who is pursuing adoption in any degree, that is a really great book. It's a short read, and it's a really good gloss over of everything that they're going through and how you can best support them. And so I always recommend that book, especially if you know someone who is pursuing adoption. American Baby is, again, get your tissue box, but it is a beautifully written book that I would highly encourage anyone to read if you're interested at all in any capacity about adoption. And then The Girls That Went Away, we talked about that already. It's a compilation of stories during the baby scoop era of women who made adoption plans or placed their children. If you're not a big book person like me, there's podcasts as well. There's tons of them, but I did want to point out Dimples in Adoption. It's actually a local, if you live in Wisconsin, adoptee and her birth mom. And they talk about their story, but they also have guests come on and talk about their stories of adoption. There's Adoptee Thoughts podcast. That is obviously mostly adoptees sharing their stories. And then Twisted Sisterhood podcast is birth parents sharing their stories. Educating others. So you can always go to your local library and check what they have for adoption. Unfortunately, in my experience, I found a lot of either not a lot or outdated, like very old books that don't talk about like open adoption and like, again, some of those changes we're seeing that are for the good. And replenish them with some books that have families, not just adoption, but who look different in whatever capacity. Check your kids' school. Do they have books that reflect all families? And then also have conversations with your children about how and why families might look different, how they are built differently. There's a lot of great broader books, right? Like I said, that aren't just specific to adoption, but Discovering Me, Super Twins, We're Different, We're the Same. So We're Different, We're the Same is a Sesame Street book, just kind of on how we all look different, but we are the same in a lot of ways. And it's a really cute book. Like I said, too, I have lots more recommendations if you're interested. And then Words Matter. So I always have to do this slide. I had to. So I've heard it all, right? As an adoptive parent, I've had a lot of interesting questions asked of me, and especially because I do education and I am such an open book, but I'm trying to help you be better when you're around adoptive families. So one of the things that we hear often is, your kids are so lucky. And that is really hard for me because as we've talked about, right, there's trauma. It's not lucky. She lost her, my kids lost their biological family. And so it's really not lucky. And so that's what, adoption stems from loss. So, you could say, I'm so happy for you. Such a different thing than, right? Like, you're so lucky. The other three questions, right? Why didn't you have kids of your own? They are my kids, adopted or not, right? Like, they are mine. How much did they cost? Well, you can Google that, and I just told you. And will you tell them they're adopted? Most, like I said, are open adoptions. I hope most families are telling their children they're adopted, but if you know they're adopted, I hope the kid knows they're adopted. So, if, you can frame it differently, right? I'm interested in learning about the adoption process and everything that goes with it. Much different, right, than like, how much did they cost? Also, be aware of the questions you're asking in front of the children, right? So imagine being an adoptee and being at a grocery store and having some stranger come up to you and ask how much they cost, right? Like, that's just not appropriate. The other thing you can say is like, congrats on growing your family, right? Like, that's awesome. Like, thank you. And then some questions I would just advise you not ask. What happened to their real parents? So again, I'm their real parents. I'm pretty sure I'm sleep deprived and, all the things that come with being a parent. Why were they given up? So oftentimes we aren't a fan of the word given up, right? Like I said, most cases in the United States now, and sometimes they are, right? They are given up, but sometimes, and most cases for us, right? Like, my kiddos' birth parents made an adoption plan. They love my kids and they just couldn't parent, right? And their story isn't yours. It's my kids. And at the end of the day, that's not something I'm comfortable sharing, right? And so oftentimes you'll see adoptive parents not share that piece because it's their child's story that doesn't need to be told. And same with the birth parents, right? Like, I can't speak for them. And that's just not something that I need to talk about. And then what if they want him back? This is a huge misconception. So adoption is permanent, right? Once that court hearing happens, it is forever. So the likelihood of that happening is very slim. They've signed their relinquishment papers. They know and have been counseled on what that means. And finalization is a process, right? It takes several months. And so, like I said, it's forever. And that kind of segues into my next thing. And I'm getting on my soapbox a little here, but I often see Adopt a Highway, Family, Sandhill Crane. You can tell I'm really bothered by the Sandhill Crane one. But around the holidays, right, where you sponsor a family for the holidays, I'm not a fan of the word adopt. Why? Because if I go shopping to buy some Christmas gifts for this family we're sponsoring with my kiddo, and we see the word adopt, she's going to think I'm taking them home with us forever, right? Because adoption to adoptees and to adoption families means permanent and forever. And when really it is a sponsorship, it's a temporary financial help. Same with the sandhill crane, right? I would love to sponsor a sandhill crane with my daughter. We love animals, but right now they use the word adopt, and I have to have the awkward conversation of we're not taking the sandhill crane home with us. um, so those are just a shift in words that I think would be really helpful for, again, adopted families. And I hope that makes sense the way I explained it. So these are some organizations I just wanted to quick talk about in Wisconsin. So Department of Human Services, everyone has them, and depending on what county you're in, I put the Dane County one on there. If you're interested in pursuing foster care at all, that is who you would contact. There's the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families, and then the Coalition for Children, Youth, and Families. These are all organizations that are amazing to reach out to if you're interested in like learning anything about like foster care or adoption in Wisconsin. And the Coalition for Children, Youth, and Families, I actually am a photographer for, and I take photos of kiddos that are going on their website. So that's definitely, if you're not even interested in fostering, but you want to help out in some way, I'm sure they could find a way. And then Wisconsin Adoption and Permanency Support, that's the picture on the upper left side, and the website is listed there. This is a great support for adoptive parents, prospective adoptive parents, birth parents, adoptees. They have support groups. They have amazing events that they put together for all parts of the adoption. And so I definitely recommend checking out their site and all the events that they have to offer. They have webinars and trainings as well. And then if you're on social media like me, on Instagram for sure, there are a ton of amazing people on there to follow. But I put a couple up here for you to check out. So Ashley Mitchell, she's a birth mom and owner of Lifetime Healing Foundation. She does post support for birth parents. Her website is bigtoughgirl.com. And then Kelsey Vanderbilt Raynard, she is a birth mom and adopt match policy and advocacy. Hope O. Baker, she's a birth mom and author if you want to check out her book. Hannah J. Matthews, she's a transracial adoptee educator and writer. Her website is hannahjmatthews.com. She has a subscription education service for transracial adoption education for adoptive parents and prospective adoptive parents. She also does mentorships for adoptees. And then in the lower left of your screen is Melissa Gooder-Richard. She's an adoptee author, and then she also runs the Adoptee Thoughts podcast. She released her second book in October this month. Last month, oh my goodness, we're November, on what white parents to know about transracial adoption, and that's on Amazon, and I would highly recommend that book. Cameron Lee, he's an adoptee and adoption competent therapist based in Minnesota. Andy Costin, she's an adoptee, trauma informed. She's also an adoptive parent and has foster care experience as well. And then Tori D. Martill, she's a transracial adoptee, speaker, writer, and her website is wreckageinwonder.com. So there are a lot of great all parts, right? Adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive parents doing a great and amazing education work. And kind of, again, some of the things, right? So we talked about advocacy, we talked about education, the things that you can take away from this presentation today. If you're looking for organizations to donate to, of course, check locally, right? In your area, in your county. I'm sure there are pregnancy support centers if you want to help women decide who are struggling to decide to parent. If you want to help other organizations, again, in your local, definitely pursue that. These are more national organizations. So Lifetime Healing Foundation supports post-care for birth parents. That means therapy. That means one-on-one, knee-to-knee, as the owner says, again, support groups for birth parents. On Your Feet Foundation does casework support. So if birth parents need help finding a job or paying for something or need therapy, or they also do birth parent retreats. HelpUsAdopt.org is one of the only grant organizations that supports all families. So LGBTQ, no matter your religion, international, whatever adoption you're pursuing. And they provide over $600,000 worth of grants a year to prospective adoptive couples nationally. Gays with Kids is an amazing organization. The owner is amazing. And that is to help LGBTQ families pursue adoption at any form, foster care, domestic infant adoption, and international. And that is a great platform if you want to donate to. And then Shared Beginnings, I mentioned. So we talked about, unfortunately, Paul Pearson and the trafficking. Shared Beginnings has helped reunify some of those birth parents with their children. They also support women who decide to parent. They also support women post-placement, meaning post giving birth and making an adoption plan. So those are just some of the many amazing organizations out there. So I wanted to leave you kind of with this. November is National Adoption Awareness Month, as I mentioned. And we've talked about international and domestic infant adoption, but the goal with this awareness month is to raise awareness for the need for foster care. So there's an urgent need for adoptive parents for children and youth in foster care. And so that's really what this month is about, even though I've talked about the other parts of adoption. The history of National Adoption Month actually dates back to 1976 with Massachusetts Governor Mike Dukakis. He announced the first adoption week, and then that grew in popularity. And then in 1984, Ronald Reagan proclaimed the first national week for adoption. And then under President Bill Clinton, the week expanded to the entire month of November in 1995. On the left, I wanted to show, you may have seen him in local news. He's been all over. But this is a friend of mine. His name is Peter. He adopted a teen out of foster care, and this is their finalization hearing on November 12th of 2020, so last year. So that's also something that happens a lot during National Awareness Month. A lot of finalizations of adoptions occur in court this month. It's the highest number of completions of adoption because of this awareness month. But if you want to follow his story, and again, you could Google his name too. There's a ton of news stories that he's been on. But his Instagram is Foster Dad Flipper, and he talks about and shares his experience of adopting a teen out of foster care. And in summary, there are 3 ways to pursue adoption in the United States: foster care, domestic infant adoption, and international adoption. Adoption can be closed, but it's preferred for it to be open. As I talked about, it's psychologically better for the adoptee. Domestic and international adoption continues to decline, and foster care continues to rise. There's always trauma with adoption, but we're constantly learning how to be and do better as adoptive parents and helping walk with the adoptee in their journey. I hope you take just one thing, whether it's going and reading a book or listening to a podcast, educating others, or donating your money or time this month. And thank you so much for your time today. My contact information, I have my email and my websites down below. On my website, I believe Hannah will be posting the link to these slides if you want access to them. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at Lovegrown Adoption Consulting. And I believe now, if anyone has questions, Hannah's going to pop back on.
Yes. Well, Paige, that was wonderful. And I definitely have a notebook full of notes after that. So thank you so much for all the resources you shared. We have a couple questions, and so I'm just going to truck our way through them. But the first question we had was, what do you think is the most important point in American history around adoption? It's a real thinker.
Ooh, man. That's a really good question. Ooh, I would definitely say probably the baby scoop era. Unfortunately, that was just where so much, like I said, trauma occurred. And that's where so many births were happening. And I think there's just so many factors that culminated into that. I don't want to call it, but a storm, right? Of the World War II ending and families, right, coming back and building homes and wanting to get pregnant. And, right, we weren't really on the cusp of having birth control as easily accessible to women. Like and then we had these pressures, right, of being unwed and getting pregnant. So yeah, I think that time frame is just so pivotal. And like I said, it's caused a lot of damage, unfortunately.
Okay. Another question we had was, how did you get into adoption consulting?
Oh man, that's a bigger story. I've always been in adoption education pretty much since I started pursuing adopting my kiddos. And I've done, radio interviews for local radio stations and podcast interviews, and I've written tons of articles on adoption. And I kept kind of coming back to and racking my brain of how can I make a small dent, right? Like there's a lot of pieces I've showed to you today that are, in my opinion, a little broken, right? And I'm one human. So I kept coming back to the prospective couples, right? And all the things I wish I would have known in the beginning of our journey that I either learned the hard way or that I didn't know what to advocate for. I didn't know what to ask. And so that's kind of, I was actually came home with our son's adoption, and I was very sleep deprived, and I started building Lovegrown's website while I was on maternity leave. just in the goal of like, if I help one family a year, great. And it's pun intended grown way more than I ever anticipated as far as consulting goes. But that was it, really. And my biggest passion or stem from adoption, I share this story occasionally. Our first adoption with our daughter, who's pictured there, the agency told us that her birth parents didn't want contact, and told her birth parents we didn't want contact. And so we were essentially lied to the entire time. Thankfully, I reached out against attorney and agency advice when my daughter was about 6 months old. And we now have an amazing relationship. She was actually here like 3 weeks ago and stayed for 4 days. So I'm very thankful I reached out, but that's where my passion stems from, of just things are still not being done ethically, and advocating for kind of the adoptee and birth parents too.
Okay, we have a really good question from Caitlin, and she said, what is the likelihood of a single person or unwed couple being able to adopt?
Oh, so likely. So foster care for sure, hands down. And I've also helped single parents pursue domestic infant adoption as well. So yeah, there's still, like we talked about, right, with the LGBTQ slide, there's definitely some agencies that discriminate. But for the most part, that has definitely has made its strides in becoming more acceptable. And yes, for foster care, I should have mentioned that too. Like, you don't have to have a perfect home. You just need to have like a safe space for this child. Yeah, you don't need to be married for a number of years and have this perfect life. I talk a lot about that too, just in me becoming an adoptive parent too, like the weight of a couple choosing us and thinking we would be better parents, right? Like, you do not have to be perfect to adopt.
And then, are you more likely to be able to adopt if you're already a foster parent?
So that depends. So we talked about with foster care, hopefully it depends on your county, depends on your caseworker too. If your caseworker is aware that you're interested in pursuing adoption, they may try and place children with you that it looks like that might be the case, right? But the ultimate goal of foster care is to reunify that child with his biological family. But of course, yes, a lot of adoptions occur out of foster care, right? And then we talked about too, there's already an average age of, a child's age is 7, who are already in foster care, and their parental rights have already been terminated, meaning they're available to be adopted. So yeah, I would say that definitely is going to help, if anything, right, in your pursuit of adopting.
And Paige, you shared a really good list of things to say and things not to say, and I have a follow-up question based off of that. So
Yeah.
What is a great way to support your friends or your family who might be pursuing adoption or have adopted? Like, what are some ways that you can show up for your people that's not, rude? Kind of along the lines of, some of your phrases too.
I was learning, listening. I thankfully I found my people, but I was very sad or disheartened by how many of some of our family or friends who were like disinterested in learning our struggles, like what we were going through. So I would say like listening. We need like support in listening to us and like what we're going through, and understanding the process a little better, because I'm constantly every day, right, combating misconceptions and awkward conversations. So just learning and listening, I think, is huge. And also be normal. Like, don't overthink it, right? Like, celebrating, I always talked about that of when you bring baby home, treat them just like I know she didn't give birth, but she's still a new mom. Like, if you want to do like a meal train for her and like bring some meals for her, or you want to help her clean her house, or you want to get a baby gift, like do that, please. Like, especially too with foster placements. Foster parents often do not get notice. They have to go pick up a child. They get a call, and it's within several hours that they have a child dropped, and it's a different age, and they may not have really anything. They're not given, like, I'm not given instructions. I'm not given winter coat, right? Like, things that I need for this child. So yeah, especially with foster care too, if they're pursuing adoption of their, ask them what they need, right? Like, do you need me to go to the store to get, right? Just as if it were, a growing family in another way.
Okay, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions, but We had a question about kind of for guests watching today, what is one thing you want someone to walk away from this fabulous presentation?
Ooh, one thing to walk away from. I think really understanding, because my area of expertise is domestic infant adoption, understanding the difference between foster care and that, because I think those two are intertwined often.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of misconceptions about both, right? Like that foster care is expensive, and I'm like, nope, that's domestic infant adoption. Or as we talked about, right? Like there's a huge need for foster care parents. There's not a need for domestic infant
Mm-hmm.
adoption parents. So I hope that my explanation of the difference, I hope you learn something about history, and I hope you take away, like I said, right, listening to a podcast, reading a book, donating to a local organization, one of those things, or advocating for a policy change, especially if you work in any of those areas at the Capitol. I hope that you can take some of that and do something with it. Like I said, whether it's listening to a podcast or reading a book.
Okay. We have a really good last question from Nick. And he said, do you know of resources for people considering foster care, particularly from adoption to prepare for life after, about adoption overall. So particularly from adoption to prepare for life after the adoption finalization, how can or how to talk about adoption or how to help children deal with their trauma, identity issues in the teen years, kind of like a well-rounded,
All the things, yeah.
all the good things.
So I would say if you're in Wisconsin Adoption and Permanency. If you're not in Wisconsin, they're like Googling local organizations. They provide a ton of resources and a whole list, especially for finding I would say a competent trauma adoption therapist for your child is huge. Therapy is great, right? But an adoption competent therapist is even better. And especially too, if your child is really little right now, get on a wait list, because unfortunately there aren't too many of them. And then you're talking about identity too, if they're a different race and you want to have a therapist who matches or is similar or not quite, you want to get on a wait list for that as well. So adoption competent therapists, contacting local organizations like Wisconsin Adoption and Permanency for some of those resources. And then I would say for like identity issues and even trauma, that slide that I had on, I know it's Instagram, but there are a lot of amazing adoptees who are doing some incredible work on identity and on trauma that they've gone through and how to help parents navigate that. And like I said too, I even shared, right, Cam, he's an adoptee and he is trained in adoption competent therapists, right? So he leads adoptive parent training groups. I mean, obviously these costs, you have to pay them further, but I wholeheartedly believe that it is worth every dollar, especially in an adoptee, coming from an adoptee, right? So I hope that helps. There's a lot of resources out there. You just gotta look for them.
No, that's very helpful. And Paige, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights with us and taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today. I really took a lot away from the session, and I will admit, I never had thought about like the adopt a highway or adopt a family thing. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up. And that's definitely something I'm going to be a bit more conscientious about and probably tell a friend too, just to help move that forward. And I also really appreciate you bringing up National Adoption Awareness Month and helping us to celebrate that as well. Here at DreamBank, we truly believe in the power of dreams and celebrate that our community is made up of fellow fearless dreamers. So as we wrap up, I have one last question that we always like to ask our speakers. What is one piece of advice you have for someone who is pursuing a dream right now, which could be potentially adopting another child or maybe participating in foster care as well, or it could be about your business. But what is one piece of advice you have for someone pursuing their dream?
Ooh, mapping it out and asking for help, because there are, whether it's adoption or whatever dream it is, there are other people out there who have probably pursued similarly things who may have other perspectives to offer you. And so I definitely think utilizing your resources of other people, it's amazing what you can accomplish with the help of other people, or like I said, who have done things similarly and can offer you some advice and guidance.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Paige. And to everyone who tuned in, we thank you for joining us. We look forward to continuing to learn, grow, and dream together. And you can learn more about our upcoming DreamBank events and content designed with your dreams in mind, including Native American Heritage Month and National Veterans and Military Families Month at amfam.com/DreamBank and by connecting with us on our social channels. So on behalf of American Family Insurance and DreamBank, we look forward to hosting you all again. And until then, keep dreaming fearlessly. Thank you.